Every empire believes it's different, that somehow, this time, things won't end the same way, that their power, their money, and their influence are immune to the forces that destroyed every great civilization before them. But history has a cruel sense of irony, because no matter how advanced, how wealthy, or how powerful, every empire eventually collapses. And the reason isn't war. It's not revolution. It's not even invasion. The real killer is internal. A slow, silent economic decay that starts with prosperity and ends with poverty. Rome, Spain, Britain, three superpowers that dominated the world, each believing their empire would last forever, yet each fell in the exact same way, following a pattern so consistent it almost feels scripted. And now, the United States is walking the same path. In this video, we'll uncover the empire collapse pattern, the repeating financial cycle that has ended every major global empire for over 2,000 years. We'll trace how Rome's debased silver coins led to economic ruin, how Spain's mountain of New World silver turned to dust, how Britain AS pound sterling, once the reserve currency of the world, collapsed in less than 30 years. And finally, how the US dollar, the modern symbol of global power, is following the same trajectory. But before we jump to conclusions, let's start where all empires begin. Every empire starts with a spark, a unifying idea, whether it's freedom, faith, or fortune, that pushes a nation to greatness. Rome began as a small republic of farmers and soldiers rising through discipline and civic duty. Spain became a global power through conquest and the riches of the New World. Britain ruled the seas through trade, innovation, and colonization. And the United States rose on the back of industry, innovation, and the global adoption of the dollar. But here's where the pattern starts. When growth seems unstoppable, governments get comfortable. They spend more, they expand their armies, they build monuments, and they start believing the wealth will never run out. In Rome, the Senate began funding lavish public games and massive armies through borrowed silver. In Spain, the monarchy spent future wealth before it even arrived from the Americas. In Britain, endless colonial wars and industrial investments required credit backed by confidence, not gold. And in America, today's deficits, wars, and welfare spending are all justified under the same illusion. Debt doesn't matter because we're too powerful to fail. But debt always matters, because when real productivity slows and spending continues to rise, the empire begins to eat itself from within. Taxes increase, inflation starts, trust fades, and soon the very currency that made the empire powerful becomes the weapon that destroys it. Rome called it the denarius. Spain called it real de ocho. Britain called it the pound sterling. And America calls it the dollar. Different names, same destiny. Let's rewind to the first empire to fall victim to this economic curse, Rome. For centuries, the Roman denarius was the most trusted currency in the world. A silver coin so stable it became the backbone of trade across Europe, Africa, and Asia. Merchants accepted it without question, because it was silver, real, tangible value. But as the empire expanded, so did its expenses. Massive armies, foreign wars, roads, aqueducts, and the constant appetite for more territory. When tax revenues couldn't keep up, emperors found an easier solution. They diluted the currency. Instead of pure silver, they began minting coins with less and less precious metal, mixing in cheaper alloys like copper and tin. To the average citizen, the coins looked the same, but inside their value was rotting. This was the first recorded case of monetary debasement, and it triggered the same chain reaction we see in modern times. Prices soared as coins lost value. The army demanded higher pay. The government minted even more coins to keep up, and soon, inflation spiraled out of control. By the time of Emperor Diocletian around 300 AD, the denarius had lost over 98% of its silver content. Rome's money, once trusted across continents, had become worthless metal. To hide the crisis, Diocletian tried wage controls, fixed prices, and harsh penalties for merchants who refused them. The result? Economic collapse, trade shortages, and black markets everywhere. Rome didn't fall in a day. It rotted from within, one coin at a time. As Rome's money lost its value, so did its moral foundation. The empire that once rewarded hard work and innovation began rewarding connections and corruption. Farmers abandoned their land because taxes were too high. Merchants stopped trading because profits were impossible under fixed prices. Soldiers, once loyal to Rome itself, became loyal to whoever paid them in gold instead of worthless coins. The system broke down slowly. Then, all at once, civil unrest grew, production collapsed, and provinces stopped sending taxes back to Rome. By the 5th century, when barbarian armies finally entered the city, the empire wasn't conquered. It was already hollow. The sword didn't end Rome. The silver did. Centuries later, another empire would rise from the ashes of medieval Europe and make the exact same mistake. Spain in the 1500s had everything Rome lost: power, land, faith, and an endless source of wealth, or so they thought. After Columbus's voyage, ships began flooding back to Spain with gold and silver from the New World. Mountains of treasure filled Spanish ports. In less than 50 years, Spain controlled the largest empire the world had ever seen, stretching from South America to the Philippines. At first, it looked like an age of infinite prosperity. Spain didn't need to produce. It could just import everything using silver coins mined by enslaved labor in the Americas. The Real de a Ocho, also known as the Piece of Eight, became the world's first truly global currency. It was accepted in Asia, Europe, and the Americas. In many ways, it was the dollar of its time. But behind the glitter was rot. Instead of investing in industries, Spain spent its treasure on wars, religious crusades, colonial conquests, and European dominance. The government borrowed against future silver shipments, and the nobility lived far beyond their means. Prices across Europe soared, a phenomenon later called the price revolution. Imagine inflation so strong that the value of silver itself drops, even as ships full of it arrive every month. That's what happened to Spain. Their wealth was self-defeating. Too much silver in circulation meant the metal's value collapsed. The more they mined, the poorer they became. It's what economists now call the resource curse. A nation so rich in natural wealth that it forgets how to produce real value. By the late 1600s, Spain was drowning in debt. Despite owning half the world, it had to borrow money from bankers in the Netherlands and Italy, the very people it once looked down upon. Repeated defaults followed. In 1557, 1575, and 1596, Spain went bankrupt, 3 times in just 40 years. Each time, the monarchy promised reform. Each time, spending increased again. And by the 18th century, Spain's empire had crumbled into corruption, inflation, and dependency. Once again, it wasn't war that ended the empire. It was debt. And yet again, history forgot the lesson. Fast forward to the 1800s. Britain rises. An island smaller than the state of Texas becomes the center of global trade, finance, and industry. Its navy ruled the seas. Its factories powered the Industrial Revolution. Its currency, the pound sterling, was as good as gold, literally. Under the gold standard, every pound note could be exchanged for a fixed amount of gold. That discipline kept the currency strong, prices stable, and trust global. By 1870, the British pound had become the world's reserve currency. Empires rose and fell around it, but sterling stood firm. And then came the same turning point, the First World War. When the war broke out in 1914, Britain suspended the gold standard to finance military spending. It printed more money, borrowed heavily, and flooded its economy with credit. It was supposed to be temporary, but as with every empire, temporary measures become permanent habits. After the war, the pound was weakened. The economy couldn't compete with rising powers like the United States, but instead of cutting spending and tightening discipline, Britain doubled down on its imperial image. It tried to maintain global dominance with shrinking wealth. In 1925, Winston Churchill, then Chancellor of the Exchequer, made a fateful decision. He restored the gold standard at the pre-war exchange rate, even though the economy was too weak to support it. Exports collapsed, unemployment soared, and the country spiraled into recession. When the Great Depression hit, Britain abandoned gold altogether. The pound devalued overnight, and within 3 decades the empire unraveled, India independent, colonies gone, debt mounting. The 1956 Suez Crisis made it official. The British Empire was no longer in charge. The United States had replaced it as the world's financial superpower, and, once again, the pattern was complete. Economic overreach, currency manipulation, collapse. Now, here's where the story takes its modern twist. After World War II, the U.S. dollar inherited the pound's throne. Under the Bretton Woods Agreement of 1944, the dollar became the global reserve currency, backed by gold at $35 per ounce. Every major country held dollars instead of gold because the U.S. promised convertibility. It was a new era of trust. America was the banker to the world. But that trust came with temptation. To fund wars in Korea and Vietnam, and the Great Society programs at home, the U.S. began printing more dollars than it had gold to back. Foreign nations noticed. France's Charles de Gaulle famously demanded payment in gold instead of paper. By 1971, U.S. gold reserves were collapsing. So President Nixon made the decision that changed history. He closed the gold window, ending the dollar's convertibility. In one move, the world left the gold standard. Money was no longer tied to anything real. It became faith-based, fiat currency. From that moment, the U.S. joined the same road Rome, Spain, and Britain had walked before. The road of easy money. Debt exploded. Inflation followed. And each time a crisis hit, 1987, 2000, 2008, 2020, the response was the same. Print more money. Trillions created out of thin air, and for decades it worked, because the world had to use dollars. Oil, trade, reserves, all denominated in U.S. currency. It gave America a unique advantage, the power to print what everyone else needed, but power invites complacency. Just like Rome's Senate, Spain's monarchy, and Britain's Parliament, Washington began believing the rules no longer applied. Deficits didn't matter. Interest rates could stay low forever. Debt ceilings were a formality. The illusion of invincibility returned. Yet behind the curtain, the pattern was repeating. The U.S. national debt surpassed $35 trillion. The dollar's share of global reserves began to shrink. And inflation, once thought extinct, came roaring back after 2020. The Federal Reserve printed over $5 trillion in less than 2 years. Prices of everything, housing, food, energy, exploded. Wages lagged behind, and global trust in the dollar began to erode. Nations started seeking alternatives. Trade in Chinese yuan, Indian rupees, or gold-backed settlements. The BRICS alliance began openly discussing a rival reserve currency. For the first time since World War II, the dollar's dominance was no longer guaranteed, and history, it seems, was beginning its next verse, because every empire falls the same way, slowly at first, then suddenly. If history truly does rhyme, then the final stage of an empire's life is always the same: denial. Every nation, just before collapse, insists it's different. Rome said it was blessed by the gods. Spain believed its empire was divinely ordained. Britain claimed it ruled by destiny, and America says it's too advanced to fail. But power doesn't disappear overnight. It fades quietly through debt, decay, and disbelief. The signs are subtle at first: rising inequality, stagnating wages, and the widening gap between the financial elite and everyone else. Then come the illusions. Markets keep rising, even as productivity falls. Governments redefine inflation and recession to make the data look better. And the currency, the symbol of the empire's strength, is silently debased. Just like the Roman denarius, the modern dollar is losing its intrinsic value, not through the melting of metal, but through the endless creation of digital credit. Between 2008 and 2025, the U.S. money supply has more than tripled. Yet, during that same period, productivity growth stagnated, real wages barely moved, and debt skyrocketed. For every dollar of growth, there are now nearly $4 of debt. That imbalance is the hallmark of a dying empire. Let's trace the stages of decline, side by side. In Rome, debasement led to inflation and mistrust. Citizens hoarded gold, trade collapsed, and the government resorted to price controls. In Spain, easy silver led to reckless spending, deindustrialization, and bankruptcy. In Britain, cheap credit and war debt forced devaluation and loss of empire. And in America, unlimited money printing has created the illusion of prosperity, while hollowing out the real economy. The cycle always begins with abundance and ends with desperation. At first, the empire grows through productivity and innovation. Then it grows through credit and speculation. Finally, it survives only through illusion, printing more, promising more, while producing less. That's when the pattern becomes irreversible. But what makes this story especially chilling is how closely the timeline matches. Rome's prosperity lasted roughly 200 years before decline. Spain's global dominance lasted around 150 years. Britain's peak, from Waterloo to World War II, lasted about 130 years. The United States, it became a global superpower in 1945. It's been about 80 years since then. We are now entering the same window, the phase of overconfidence, internal division, and financial decay that always comes before the fall. There's another eerie parallel: the reserve currency curse. Every empire's currency, when it becomes the world standard, eventually collapses under its own weight. Why? Because reserve status is both a blessing and a trap. It allows a nation to consume more than it produces, import without limits, and borrow at the lowest cost. But that privilege creates dependency. Domestic industries fade because it's cheaper to outsource. Foreign debt rises because everyone wants your paper. And when the rest of the world finally loses faith in that paper, the system implodes. Britain lived this in 1949. Spain lived it in the 1600s. And the U.S. is living it now. One by one, the world's largest economies are reducing their reliance on the dollar. China and Russia conduct energy trades in yuan. India settles oil payments in rupees. Saudi Arabia has openly discussed joining BRICS and accepting multiple currencies for oil. Central banks, meanwhile, are buying gold at record rates, not dollars. In 2022 and 2023, central banks bought over 1,000 tons of gold per year, the highest since records began. That's not a coincidence. That's preparation. They see what's coming. Because when trust fades, gold returns. But let's step back for a moment. Why do empires fall in the same way, even when they know the history? It's not ignorance, it's human nature. When prosperity lasts long enough, people forget where it came from. Discipline becomes greed. Innovation turns into speculation. And the values that built the empire are slowly replaced by comfort and consumption. In Rome, civic duty turned into corruption. In Spain, faith turned into fanaticism. In Britain, thrift turned into entitlement. And in America, capitalism has turned into creditism. The idea that wealth can be created simply by printing it. But paper promises can't defy reality forever. Every empire also experiences the same psychological pattern. Stage 1, confidence. We are unstoppable. Stage 2, complacency. we can handle a little debt. Stage 3. Corruption. Everyone's getting rich, don't question it. Stage 4. Crisis. Why is everything suddenly falling apart? Stage 5. Collapse. Who could have seen this coming? Rome reached stage 5 in the 4th century, Spain in the 17th, Britain in the mid-20th, and America is teetering between stage 3 and 4. The 2008 financial crisis was a warning shot. So was the pandemic stimulus of 2020. Each time the system nearly broke, and each time the solution was the same: more debt. It's like giving a patient more sugar to cure diabetes. It feels good at first, but it makes the disease terminal. The U.S. is now running trillion-dollar deficits during times of peace and prosperity, something no empire in history has ever sustained. Interest payments alone on the national debt are projected to surpass defense spending within just a few years. Think about that. The world's most powerful military will soon cost less than the interest on its own debt. That's not strength. That's terminal decline. And yet, most people don't see it coming, because collapse doesn't look like collapse from the inside. When Rome fell, citizens still attended games at the Colosseum. When Spain defaulted, nobles still wore gold and silk. When Britain lost its empire, London still sparkled with lights and trade. Empires don't end in darkness, they end in denial. Even now, the stock market rises, new technologies explode, and the U.S. dollar remains the world's strongest currency. For now. But underneath that surface, the foundation is crumbling. Just like Rome's coins, Spain's silver, and Britain's pound. The dollar's value depends entirely on one fragile thing: trust. Trust that the government will control spending. Trust that the Federal Reserve can manage inflation. Trust that the system will always work. But trust, once lost, is never regained. And that brings us to the most important question of all. If every empire has followed this same economic death spiral, can the United States break the pattern? Or is it already too late? To answer that, we have to look at what happens in the final act, when the currency crisis hits and the illusion of stability finally shatters. Because every empire, before its fall, tries one last desperate move, a fix that always fails. Rome tried price controls. Spain tried more silver. Britain tried devaluation. And America has tried quantitative easing. But what happens when even printing money stops working? That's where we go next. When printing money no longer creates prosperity, when each new dollar buys less and less, the empire reaches the final stage of collapse: monetary exhaustion. This is the moment when citizens stop believing in their own currency, when savings turn into spending, when capital flees to safer assets, and when governments, desperate to maintain control, do what they've always done in the end. They try to reset the system. Rome melted down its coins. Spain defaulted on its debt. Britain abandoned gold. And the United States, in our lifetime, is moving toward a digital dollar, a new kind of currency controlled not by markets or metals, but by code and policy. The question is it innovation or desperation? Throughout history, every empire facing collapse has looked for a way to start over without admitting defeat. They call it reform, revaluation, or modernization. But it's always the same thing: a disguised devaluation of trust. In Rome, Emperor Constantine introduced a new gold coin, the solidus, to restore confidence after the denarius collapsed. It worked for a while, but only by shrinking the economy and concentrating power in the elite. In Spain, after multiple defaults, the monarchy seized church assets and imposed new taxes on its colonies, fueling resentment and revolution. And in Britain, the 1949 and 1967 devaluations of the pound were presented as necessary adjustments, but they permanently ended its status as the world's reserve currency. Now, in America, policymakers are floating the same kind of reset. a central bank digital currency, a new, programmable form of money that could replace cash, track every transaction, and allow instant control of inflation through digital policy. It sounds modern, efficient. But beneath the surface, it may represent the same historic pattern. When the old money system collapses, the empire creates a new one to maintain control, not to restore freedom. At this point, the pattern isn't just financial. It's psychological and political. Because as the money weakens, the social fabric tears. In the final years of Rome, class divisions exploded. The rich hoarded land, while ordinary citizens depended on government grain handouts. In Spain, endless taxation of the working class led to revolts and emigration. In Britain, strikes, inflation, and unemployment tore through the 1970s. And in America, that same division is visible today. The top 10% own more wealth than the bottom 90% combined. Inflation eats away at savings, while the stock market thrives on printed money. The middle class, once the empire's foundation, is shrinking every year. When that balance breaks, no amount of political promises can hold an empire together. But there's always one final illusion that delays collapse: the hope of technological salvation. Rome believed better roads and walls could preserve its power. Spain relied on its fleets and fortresses. Britain believed the telegraph and the steam engine would keep it on top. And the United States believes technology, AI, crypto, automation, will save it from economic gravity. Yet technology doesn't erase debt, overconsumption, or moral decay. It accelerates them. Every new innovation makes the system more efficient at creating money and inequality, not more stable. When Rome built better minting tools, it didn't save the empire. It just produced bad coins faster. When Spain expanded mining operations, it didn't create wealth. It destroyed value faster. And when the Federal Reserve builds faster systems for printing or programming money, it won't restore value. It will amplify the collapse. Because the core problem isn't the tools, it's the mindset. Every empire that falls shares one fatal belief: that wealth can exist without productivity, that power can last without restraint, and that money can be manipulated without consequence. But the universe doesn't tolerate imbalance. Eventually, reality reclaims its due. And when it does, the collapse looks sudden. But it's been building for decades. You can already see the tremors. Major nations moving away from the dollar system. Record-high global debt surpassing $350 trillion. Western economies depending more on speculation than production. And inflation eroding faith in the system faster than it can be repaired. The parallels to the past aren't coincidental. They're mathematical. Rome fell when its money supply tripled in less than a century. Spain fell when its silver supply exploded. Britain fell when it borrowed beyond its GDP. And America is now running deficits of over $1 trillion every single quarter. You don't need a prophet to see where this goes. So, what happens after the fall? That's the part history always leaves open. After Rome collapsed, Europe entered centuries of darkness, but also rebirth. After Spain's fall, the Netherlands and later Britain rose. After Britain's decline, America took the mantle. Empires die, but civilization evolves. And that means, after the dollar, something else will rise. It might be digital. It might be decentralized. It might even be multipolar, shared between multiple nations instead of one. But it will not be the same system we know today. The transition will be turbulent. Currencies will reprice, inflation will surge, and entire industries may vanish. But history suggests there's always renewal on the other side. If the old world was built on debt, perhaps the next will be built on real value again. Still, that transition won't be easy. Every collapse tests not just economies, but the character of the people living through it. When Rome fell, some hoarded gold. Others built monasteries that preserved knowledge for centuries. When Spain fell, merchants fled. But entrepreneurs in the Netherlands used that capital to start a new global trading system. When Britain lost its empire, it reinvented itself as a financial hub. The fall of an empire isn't the end of the world. It is the end of an illusion. Those who recognize the pattern early survive. Those who cling to the illusion perish with it. Empires don't collapse because of enemies. They collapse because of economics. War, politics, and revolution are symptoms, not causes. The real disease is monetary decay and moral complacency. Every reserve currency eventually self-destructs through overissuance, whether it's silver, paper, or digital. Money only holds power when it's backed by trust and discipline. Collapse is also opportunity. Those who adapt, who move early, who invest in real assets, skills, and innovation, they don't just survive the transition, they lead the next era. We are living through the late stages of a financial empire. The same signs are visible: inflation, debt, division, denial. But just as every collapse is inevitable, every renewal is possible. The question isn't if the U.S. empire will end. It's what comes after. A digital empire, a decentralized one, or another cycle of illusion and decay? That choice isn't written yet. History doesn't repeat itself exactly. It rhymes, but the verse is ours to finish. If you've learned something from this story, from Rome's coins, Spain's silver, Britain's pound, and America's dollar, then remember, the real empire isn't the nation or the currency. It's the belief system behind it. And when that belief changes, the world changes. So pay attention. The next chapter of history is already being written, and it might just begin with the end of the dollar. If you found this video thought-provoking, share it with someone who still believes empires last forever, because understanding the past might be the only way to survive the future.